My son called me on a cold afternoon. He went straight to the point. This Christmas, he didn't want me to come, not because of distance, but because I embarrassed him. I smiled. I answered with one word. Okay. 30 years drifting at sea. I thought I was building a family. Turns out I was only building a support system. When I hung up, I understood the bitterest paradox of all. I lost the right to be a father at the exact moment I still had enough money to buy something else. Before I go on with this story, if you're listening at home in your car or during a quiet night somewhere, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from. And don't forget to hit subscribe. Now, let me tell you what happened right after that call. I set the phone down on the table as if it had just finished the final line of a report. No shaking hands, no sigh. Just a clean, empty space opening up inside my head. I looked at the suitcase, still half open. Inside were a few old clothes, a pair of shoes that had followed me through too many airports, and that familiar smell of metal sea salt and thyme. I thought I was getting ready to go home. Turns out I was getting ready to accept that I no longer had one. I closed the suitcase. Not hard, just enough for the lock to snap with a dry sound. In that moment, I wasn't angry at Brandon. I was tired. Tired in the way a man gets when he has done everything by the book of responsibility and still gets crossed out on the last page. The old oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico sat quietly under the sunset. I stood on the deck, looking out at a sea so calm it felt unreal. 30 years ago, I stood here with a younger body and a simple belief. If I worked hard enough, my family would never lack anything. I believed my absence today would be paid back with their security tomorrow. I believed in checks, wire transfers, and promises that were never spoken out loud. There were birthdays where I could only manage a 5-minute call between shifts. There were Christmases when I sent the gifts early, then boarded a helicopter back out to sea. Brandon grew up through photographs. Megan grew up through tuition invoices. I kept telling myself, one day they would understand that a father isn't always present, but he is always responsible. That call proved I was wrong. Not a small mistake. A mistake at the root. I went back into the crew quarters, opened my laptop, and checked the schedule. The words, "Final Technical Consulting Assignment," stared back at me like a proper ending. I had thought that after this trip I would finally give more time to my family. But my family had just decided to save me the effort. I sat down and poured myself a glass of water, not whiskey. I wanted my head clear enough to remember everything exactly as it was. And once I started remembering, the pieces began to fall into place on their own. Brandon said he needed personal space. I knew that tone. The voice of someone trying to keep things looking neat. I remembered hearing that same voice when he explained why he needed more money for a down payment on a place in New York. I remembered Chloe standing behind him, silent but nodding at all the right moments. That night I opened my email. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just rereading old messages. Quick thank yous. Polite. All sounding the same. Thanks, Dad. Everything's handled. Don't worry. I realized I had never once received a message asking, "Dad, are you okay?" One email from an acquaintance in real estate accidentally filled in what Brandon never said. A Christmas event was being planned. Not a family dinner. A launch party. A place where Brandon needed to appear successful, untethered from the past, and without the image of a father who once stood in ocean wind and the smell of oil. When I understood that, I didn't feel angry. I felt something colder. A simple truth. I wasn't invited because I didn't fit the picture my son was trying to hang on the wall. I looked at myself in the mirror. Gray hair, weathered skin, eyes that no longer looked eager. I had believed those marks were badges of sacrifice. To Brandon, they were probably something to be hidden. That night, I didn't go to sleep right away. I sat there running numbers in my head. The habit of an engineer. 30 years. 12 months each year. Regular transfers. Guarantees. Signatures I placed without reading too closely, because I trusted who was receiving them. I asked myself what I had actually taught my children. Had I taught them that family is a steady cash flow, that presence can be replaced by an on-time transfer? When that question surfaced, I knew I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep playing the silent father, and I couldn't explode like a stranger either. I needed to look straight at the system I had built with my own hands. The next morning, I called Silas. No small talk. I told him I needed to know exactly where I stood. His voice dropped as if he had been waiting for this call for a long time. We agreed to meet, not to complain, but to take inventory. Before leaving the rig, I stood on the deck a little longer. The sea was still calm, but inside me, something had closed. Not the door to anger, the door to illusion. I understood that from the moment I said, "Okay," everything had already started moving. And this time, I would not stand on the sidelines and watch. The meeting with Silas took place in a small office, yellow light, the smell of old paper. He didn't ask if I was okay. We've known each other long enough to skip the polite questions. I set my hat on the table and sat up straight, the way you do when you're about to hear the results of a test you've suspected for a long time. Silas opened the files. Not one folder, several. He lined them up neatly, almost coldly. I looked at the numbers before I looked at the names. Old professional habit. And the numbers spoke clearly. I wasn't just providing support. I was running a system. The townhouse in New York was in my name. Megan's apartment loan in Chicago was backed by my assets. Her graduate tuition was paid on a fixed schedule, like a salary. Chloe's credit card limit was higher than anything I ever allowed myself when I was still working. Small expenses, adding up into something heavy. I had never seen the full picture. I just signed. Because I trusted. Silas stopped at a summary page. He spoke slowly as if to let me keep up. I didn't need him to. I had been keeping up for years. This was just the first time I looked straight at it. I asked one question. If I stop, what happens? Silas didn't answer right away. He understood that this wasn't only a financial question. I left the office with a strange feeling. Not relief. Clarity. And when things are clear, you lose your excuses for lying to yourself. I flew to New York in silence. No warning. No visits. I rented a small hotel room across the street from Brandon's townhouse. In the mornings, I sat at the corner cafe, ordered a hot black coffee, and watched. I was used to observing systems from a distance. It turned out my family was one, too. Cars came and went. Delivery workers carried in large boxes wrapped in glossy paper. I recognized the gifts I had sent early. I remembered choosing them carefully. Not because they were expensive, but because I thought they fit. I watched a housekeeper carry a few boxes out back. Minutes later, they sat neatly in the trash. Unopened. No anger. Just confirmation. That afternoon, I saw Brandon step outside, laughing into his phone. He looked exactly like the image he was selling. Chloe followed behind, checking her bag, adjusting her coat. Neither of them looked toward the cafe. I didn't expect them to. I didn't need to be seen. I just needed to see. That night back in my room, I didn't turn on the television. I opened my notebook. I wrote down what needed to be done, one line at a time. No emotion. Like planning maintenance for a structure that had been neglected too long. I called Silas. This time, I was clear. Not a temporary pause. A cut in supply. Orderly, time-bound, with proper legal notice. Silas wasn't surprised. He only asked if I was ready for the consequences. I told him I had been living with them for years, just under a different name. I stayed in New York for the next few days, but lived like an outsider. I walked cold streets, looked up at lit windows. I thought about the winters I wasn't there. I wondered if my presence back then would have changed anything. The answer didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that I could no longer replace presence with money. Silas sent me the draft notices. Transfers suspended, ownership reviewed, requests for clarification on asset use. I read every word, barely changed a thing. It was all correct, so correct it didn't need explanation. One morning, I returned to the cafe. The townhouse was still there, polished and discreet. I knew inside they had no idea what was coming. I felt no satisfaction in that. I only noticed my heartbeat was steadier. That afternoon, the first email came from Chloe. No greeting, just a short question about a delayed payment. I didn't reply. I let Silas handle it. By the book. Everything needed to be put back in its proper place. That night, I stood in front of the mirror in my hotel room. I didn't see an abandoned father. I saw a man who had finally stopped fixing damage he didn't cause. I understood that ingratitude doesn't appear overnight. It grows in an environment fed by convenience. When I turned off the lights, my phone vibrated. A missed call from Brandon. I didn't answer. Not out of spite, but because I had chosen a different way to speak, through action. Outside, the city kept making noise. Inside me, a curtain had just been pulled back, not to expose them, but to let me see myself more clearly than ever before. And once the truth was visible, I knew the next part would not be quiet. The next morning I woke up very early. The city hadn't found its noise yet. I brewed coffee with the small machine in the room, stood there watching the steam rise, and thought about the systems I used to oversee. When a valve is shut, pressure doesn't disappear. It just finds another way out. My family was no different. By noon, the effects started to show. I didn't have to guess. The phone spoke for itself. Not a call this time. Notifications. An email from the bank confirming the payment suspensions had been executed. A message from Silas. Completed. I stared at that word for a long time. Not because I was worried, because I knew from here on out none of this would stay within the reach of my emotions. By afternoon, the phone kept vibrating. I didn't answer. I placed it face down on the table. The vibrations still traveled through the wood. Steady, urgent. I let them run their course like an alarm on an oil rig during a malfunction. My job wasn't to chase the noise. My job was to make sure the procedure was correct. Eventually, I picked up. Not out of softness, but because I needed to hear how the system reacted. Chloe's voice came first. Hi. Rushed. She talked about a store, about a card that no longer worked, about embarrassment. No greeting. No question about whether I was okay. I listened without interrupting. When she stopped, I said that all financial matters should now be handled through legal counsel. Then I hung up. Less than 5 minutes later, Megan called. Her voice was different. Not angry. Panicked. She talked about her car not starting, about overdue notices. I listened and remembered the day I signed that lease, thinking at least she would have safe transportation. I told her briefly that those matters were no longer mine to handle. She went quiet. It was the first time I had ever heard that kind of silence from my child. That evening, Brandon called. This time I answered. His voice was no longer controlled. He asked what I was doing. He talked about family, responsibility, about how I couldn't abandon them like this. I let him talk. When he asked if I was listening, I told him I was hearing him very clearly. I said I wasn't abandoning anyone. I was simply stepping out of the role they had assigned me. The call didn't end well. I wasn't surprised. I poured myself a small glass of bourbon. Not much. Just enough to warm my throat. I sat by the window, looking at the Christmas lights strung along the street. Christmas was getting close, and for the first time in many years, I didn't have to plan gifts or transfers. The feeling was both empty and light. The next day, Silas sent another update. Legal notices had been delivered. Clear timelines. No exceptions. I read everything carefully. All of it was by the book. I didn't see myself as punishing anyone. I was returning things to their proper names. The phone buzzed again. This time, a text. Brandon wrote more than usual. He said I was tearing the family apart, that his kids wouldn't understand what was happening. At the end, he mentioned my grandchildren. Said that if I didn't change, I wouldn't get to see them anymore. I read that part twice. Not because it hurt, because I saw it clearly. That was the last leverage he had. I didn't respond right away. I put on my coat and went out for a walk. The air was cold, but my head was clear. I thought about the times I wasn't there when Brandon was young. I had believed I was making up for it in other ways. Now I understood. Some absences can't be filled with anything. When I got back to the room, I sent Silas a short message. Log all contact. Then I replied to Brandon. I said I would not negotiate using children's emotions. I said if he wanted to talk, we would talk like adults, with lawyers present. Nothing more. That night I slept deeply. No dreams. In the morning I woke up with a strange feeling. Quiet. Not because everything was finished, but because I no longer had to react. I was acting. The calls slowed, then returned in a different form. No more shouting. Questions. Confusion. I didn't interfere. I let things run on their own momentum. When the supply is cut, those who depend on it are forced to face reality. That afternoon, a short message came from Silas. They want to meet. I stared at the words for a long time. I knew this moment would come. Not because they wanted me, because they needed me. And that difference told me the meeting would not be easy. I stood in front of the mirror and adjusted my coat. I wasn't trying to look younger. I wasn't trying to look strong. I just wanted to show up exactly as I was. A father who had stopped providing. A man reclaiming his right to be respected. As I stepped out of the room, I knew the domino effect wasn't over. It had just reached the point of no return. And so had I. We agreed to meet in the lobby of a theater near Central Park, a place Brandon once said was appropriate for serious conversations. I understood what he meant. It was somewhere he could play his role. Polished, established, seen. I arrived 10 minutes early, not to gain leverage. I've always arrived early. I hate being rushed. The lobby was brightly lit, the smell of polished wood, the steady sound of leather shoes on stone. I stood near a large column watching people move in and out, faces carefully prepared, conversations light, barely touching the ground. I thought about the years I spent in loud engine rooms, where things were only right or wrong, no room for performance. Brandon arrived with Chloe and Megan. They looked different from a few days ago. Not their clothes, their eyes. Brandon walked fast, stopped in front of me, as if ready to speak before his words were fully arranged. Chloe glanced around, irritated by the bright lights. Megan stood slightly behind them, silent, gripping her bag strap. We skipped long greetings. Brandon spoke first. He talked about misunderstandings, pressure, about how I had overreacted. I listened without interrupting. I've learned that when you let people talk, they usually reveal more than they intend. Chloe cut in. She said I was controlling them with money. She used the word toxic. I noted it, didn't argue. I just held her gaze, long enough for her to stop. Megan lowered her head. What I saw there wasn't regret. It was fear. I said I wasn't there to argue. I was there to clarify what needed to be clear. Brandon asked if I still considered them family. He played it like a final card. I said, family is not a place where people only show up when payments are due. As the air grew heavy, Silas arrived. Right on time. Not early, not late. He carried a thin folder. When Brandon saw him, he froze. I knew he understood what Silas's presence meant. Silas skipped pleasantries. He spoke about the notices that had been sent, the timelines, the procedures. Clear, neutral. Brandon tried to push back. He said, I was destroying the last relationship I had. Silas listened, then paused, turned to me, and asked if I wanted to add anything. I nodded. I said there was one thing they didn't know. Brandon raised an eyebrow, bracing himself. I didn't disappoint. I told them I had sold my entire personal investment portfolio, not because I was out of money, but because I no longer wanted money standing between me and anyone. I said I used those funds to establish a scholarship foundation for the children of people I once worked with offshore. It didn't carry my name, and it wasn't for my family. No one spoke for several seconds. Chloe broke the silence. She asked what I was trying to prove. I told her I wasn't proving anything. I was choosing. At that moment, a man approached. I recognized him immediately. An old assistant of mine, someone who worked night shifts with me years ago. He looked older, thinner, but his eyes were the same. He stopped, greeted me by name, then turned to my family and said he just wanted to say thank you. For the medical assistants years ago, the help that got his child through a difficult time. No one planned that moment. It happened like a natural comparison. A man with no shared blood stood there, expressing gratitude. 3 people who carried my last name stood silent, unsure where to look. Brandon tried to regain control. He said I was embarrassing them in public. I replied that I hadn't chosen this place. He had. I simply showed up on time. Chloe said I was selfish. I nodded. I said maybe I was. But this was the first time in my life I had put myself ahead of a system that had drained me dry. Megan finally spoke. She asked if I still loved them. I looked at her for a long moment. I said affection cannot survive when it only flows in one direction. Silas held out an envelope. Not for them, for me. Inside was the final confirmation of the Foundation's establishment. I signed it without hesitation. The sound of pen on paper echoed clearly in the quiet space. I felt a very concrete ending. Brandon looked at me and said, I would regret this. I told him I had lived long enough to know the difference between regret and relief. They are not the same. Chloe turned away. Megan stayed still, eyes red, but she didn't cry. I said the meeting ended here, not because I had nothing left to say, because I had said enough. I greeted Silas, nodded to my old assistant, and walked out of the lobby. I didn't look back. Outside, the air was cold, but clean. I took a deep breath. For the first time in many years, I didn't feel like I was leaving something behind. I was moving forward, and I knew, after tonight, nothing would ever return to the way it was. I left the theater after the streetlights came on. No one called after me. No footsteps followed. I walked slowly, letting my breathing catch up with what had just happened. Everything behind me closed neatly. No noise, no shattering, just a door closing at the right moment. That night, back at the hotel, I packed my things. Not much. I've never lived with many possessions. Before sleeping, I opened the envelope Silas had given me. Not legal papers. A confirmation for an early morning flight. I had decided already. I just hadn't said it out loud. When a chapter ends, I don't like standing there staring at it for too long. The next morning I left New York while the sky was still gray with fog. On the plane I looked at the rows of occupied seats and thought about all the years I flew back and forth for work. This time was different. I wasn't chasing deadlines. I wasn't carrying any responsibility except myself. That feeling didn't make me younger. It made me stand straighter. I arrived in the Gulf of Mexico in the afternoon. The sea hadn't changed much. The same familiar salt in the air. The same steady wind. I stepped onto the ship that had been waiting. Not a glossy yacht. Just a vessel solid enough to go far. I chose it for a simple reason. I trust things that work quietly, without showing off. When the ship left the dock, I stood at the bow and watched the land pull away. I didn't feel like I was running away. I had stayed long enough to say what needed to be said. Behind me there were no more urgent calls. I had blocked the numbers. Not to punish anyone. To create the silence we all needed. On the first night aboard, I sat alone and opened a new notebook. The first page was blank. I wrote the title, First Day of My Life. Not because I was starting from zero, but because for the first time I was living without compensating for old choices. The days that followed moved slowly. I woke early, drank coffee, watched the sea change color with the light. I talked with the crew. Short conversations. Direct. No detours. I noticed I smiled more easily. Not because I was happy. Because I wasn't tense anymore. One morning, an email arrived from Silas. Brief. The scholarship fund had received its first applications. Some familiar last names. Children of people I once worked with offshore. I read every line carefully. Not with pride, but to make sure the money was exactly where it belonged. I replied with one word. Good. A few days later, I turned my phone back on for the first time since blocking the numbers. Not to call anyone, just to check the time. There was an email from Megan. Short. No request for money. She wrote that she had found a part-time job, that she understood things wouldn't go back to how they were, but she wanted to learn how to stand on her own. She ended with a small question. When would I be free to talk? If I wanted to. I didn't reply right away. I didn't need to decide immediately. But I didn't delete the email either. I left it there, like a door not fully locked. I understood then that a good ending isn't everyone returning to the old shape. It's each person learning how to move forward in their own direction, without pulling someone else down with them. That afternoon I wrote again. I wrote about my mistakes, not to blame myself, but to remember. I wrote that long-term financial support can distort relationships, that family bonds need boundaries to survive. I wrote like an engineer, clear bullet points, but between those lines I wrote a few very human sentences. That I miss children's laughter. That I hope one day I can see my grandchildren again, without having to sign any more paperwork. When the sun went down, the sea darkened. I stood up and walked the length of the ship. My body isn't quick anymore, but I feel more solid. I no longer have a role to perform, no image to protect. I am a man who has completed his part and is learning how to live the rest. On the final night of that first journey, I sat on deck, listening to the steady rhythm of the waves. I thought about what I had said in the theater, about a decaying structure. I realized not everything that collapses is a failure. Some things must be carefully dismantled, so they don't crush what's still alive. I closed the notebook. The sea air was cool. I don't know what the future will bring. And for the first time, that feels okay. The end of this story isn't separation, it's reordering. And in that new order, I found something simple but solid. Peace. That comes from living truthfully, even if it comes late. If you've listened this far, you probably understand what it feels like to learn how to let go, in order to keep yourself. If this story made you think, please like, subscribe, and share, so honest family stories like this can reach more people. Thank you for staying until the final moment. Your presence is the reason these stories are told.